All right, so when we start talking about tissues, a couple of things to recognize is as we go through this, remember that we're looking at changes in detail. We're looking at increases in complexity as we move through. Now, to get to tissues, we're going to start at the chemical level, cellular level, to the tissue level. Now, some things to remember as a reminder, you already know this, atoms are the building blocks of matter. Cells are what we consider the smallest unit in all living organisms. You need to make sure you review the memorization where it talks about the organelles, review that section in your book, which is the chapter 2 where it talks about the basics of chemistry. Remind yourself about macromolecules, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids, things like that. And then cells, basically a review from biology. Now, if they're the smallest unit in all living organisms, that means cells come together to form our tissues. Big point here. Similar types, similar function. Okay? So that's what makes a tissue. Now, tissues comprise the organs. So we're looking at 2 or more tissues in most organs, and then organs come together for organ systems, digestive system, muscular system, nervous system, etc. 11 total systems in the body, which we've already looked at in the previous chapter. And then when we look at the organism, we see all of these organs, all of these organ systems working towards an overall function, maintaining homeostasis, basics of life. Now, as we go through here and we're looking at tissues, keep in mind a couple of things. Protein synthesis. This figure is in your book, okay, 316. You need to review and remind yourself of this. Now, it's based on the central dogma. The central dogma is changing a little bit with modern study, some new research that's being done in biology, but the gist is still the case. We look at DNA producing the mRNA. The mRNA is what we use to produce the polypeptide chain. The changes in the polypeptide chain are what produce different proteins. When we talk about proteins, what you want to remember is all proteins are impacted by, go back to biology. Proteins are impacted by heat. Proteins are impacted by pH or changes in the hydrogen ion level. Proteins are basically used everywhere and for everything in the body, from controlling chemical reactions. In other words, every chemical reaction is enzyme mediated, meaning an enzyme is what allows you to go from A to B. We use proteins to hold everything together. A lot of our cells are very high, have a lot of protein, the muscle cells, for example. So we see that. Now, what's important here is when we look at cell diversity is literally a product of these expressions of different genes. So cell diversity is going to be a byproduct of different genes being turned on and off. So when we look at cell diversity, we have everything from fibroblasts to blood cells, epithelial cells for covering and lining, skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, fat cells, macrophages. What you have to remember is every single cell in our body comes with the same DNA. The same DNA is in everything. So what accounts for the diversity has to be related to genes being turned on and off. We see different structural differences linked to functional differences. So those genes that are turned on and off produce different structures. The structure is very much linked to the function. Now, that's one of the great things about our study of anatomy and physiology now, is that we can see, because of what people have done in the past, we can link that structure to function. It's not always obvious. Alright, so when you look at different cells, and we look at the cell diversity again, it's not always obvious that what the macrophage's job is. Something like the fat cell, you have a huge storage vacuole here. It's going to have something to do with storage. I mean, that's kind of obvious. We see a skeletal muscle based on the fibers, based on the proteins, changes shape, but you don't necessarily know how excitable it is. So again, we know that there's going to be a link between form and function. This difference in form and function is going to be related to the genes that are turned on and off. That's what produces our varying cells, the cell diversity that we see within the human body. And then when we go through, as we go into the next sections, we're looking at the different tissues. So our primary tissues: epithelium, connective, nervous tissue, and muscle tissue.